Try to push on all sorts of things. So when we see, so for example, environmentalism, there's some, what I think of as some positive things that came out of the New Deal, but the New Deal era was exactly when redlining was going on. It was actually out of, so it's, what I'm saying is it's a little bit mixed story a lot of times, right? And so, so that, plus zoning, exclusionary zoning. We started with racial zoning in Louisville in 1917. It got struck down by the United States Supreme Court in Buchanan versus Worley. Okay, so but Louisville is infamous for this case in which we were actually using race as the basis for segregating land uses based on not the use but the people. Okay, and so so we sort of put all that together, and what you get is that land use has kept some communities relatively powerless while building the power, not only the political power but the wealth and the economic power of other communities. Okay, and so that is part of our history, part of how the system has functioned. Okay, and lots of problems with it, but that's the injustices and concerns. But when we sort of think about this is a place where those kinds of battles for which communities are going to have what powers, that happens in the land use planning and regulatory system. The system is also a mediating system between freedom and boundaries. Okay, so there, and despite what anyone suggests theoretically to you, there is practically in the United States no regulation-free area. Okay, so Houston does not have zoning, but Houston has lots of land use regulation. Okay, and we can look at Houston as a way to think about critiquing zoning. But in terms of land use regulation, there is mostly no area that it lacks land use regulation. Okay, so there is no total freedom from land use regulation in the United States. There are maybe some exceptional examples that there are actually in South Texas. Well, there were at one time in South Texas these developments called colonias. They were unincorporated areas out in counties in Texas where there was no land use or planning power. They were created by developers. These are communities inhabited almost entirely by low-income Latinos, mostly people who have immigrated or come to the U.S. in one way or the other from Mexico. And there's a lot of job opportunities, or there were at one time in the area, so people moved there. And the developers created these entire communities, this entire land communities called colonias, where there was no running water, no electricity, no sewer system, no paved streets. Okay, they were, for all intents and purposes, essentially third world communities in the United States because there were no land development controls.
Well, you kind of answered my question. You said they were unincorporated. I was just going to ask if they were similar to West Virginia. West Virginia has like a lot of unincorporated. They're essentially towns, but they don't have like some of these other.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. But what's interesting is, over time, even though these develop, over time there get to be various ways in which, even if there is no zoning, there ends up being some ways in which some degree of regulation gets brought. So it's by the state, by regulation of utility providers, and so on and so forth. And to be honest with you, part of what happens is these conditions get a fair amount of media attention, and people are shocked, and that creates sort of a wave again where people define places, communities relate to power, and so you end up getting some pushback. So by and large, for the most part, in any sustained way over decades, there is no place that is truly free from land use controls of some sort or other. On the other hand, there is no place that has a totally controlled system of land use planning and management. Okay, so where there is total centralized control over land use. Okay, there are places that have quite a lot of regulation. Okay, but in every part of the United States, economic forces have effect. Right? I mean, so the regulation itself cannot control. Local land use regulation does not control global markets. Right? It just doesn't. And so, at one point, and you're going to hear, I'm going to probably use this example again, but the city of Laguna Beach was trying to use, out in California, was trying to use its zoning powers to dictate what kinds of products different stores sold in their stores. Now, I'm not talking about, that this is going to be a grocery store versus a drugstore. What I'm talking about is these brands, we want the, so this store's going to sell shoes, but we want higher caliber, higher quality shoes. Right? I mean, it's very, very regulatory, right? Okay, so Laguna Beach, anybody been to Laguna Beach? In California? No? Nobody? So it's a sort of picturesque, kind of, it's down south of Newport Beach, it's on the coast, it's picturesque, it's pretty, it's lots of, it's a kind of artisan community and so forth. And there are lots of people who've lived there for a long time, in there, they're in Southern California, they've got this kind of, I don't know, charming coastal village thing that they don't want anybody to change, right? And it's fancy schmancy, it's very expensive, and so forth. And so they're trying to use their zoning powers. Hey, totally fluffed, totally fair. Well, if nothing else, those businesses can just simply move somewhere else. They move up the coast to Newport Beach, and people go buy their shoes there, right? And so forth. And so, so that didn't work. But sometimes we sort of look at the planning from the lens of like centralized planned economies of communism or those kinds of things and so forth, and that is not anywhere close to what happens in the United States, even in the most regulated communities. So economics plays a role. The other thing is demographics. Okay? So one of the things that happened, you're going to hear me say this again at some other point, but one of the things that happened in the city of Anaheim, where you will, unfortunately for you, hear me frequently talk about my experiences as the chairman of the planning commission for the city of Anaheim, California. So at some point I will relate to you my Disney experiences. But one of the things that happened there is that the planning commission, over a number of years, would approve a variety of proposals for apartment complexes, and the city council would vote 3-2 to reverse our decision and reject the proposed development. and you sort of apartment after apartment. And a lot of this was driven by residents who said, you know, Anaheim was becoming too crowded, the schools couldn't handle the new residents, the streets and the traffic couldn't handle the new residents, and what was often unstated but sort of hidden thing was these were largely older white residents who didn't like the fact that you had a lot of young Latino families, recent immigrants, that sort of thing coming in and moving into their neighborhoods. So there was an attempt to kind of, again, preserve the existing sort of status quo in Anaheim by using zoning powers to reject new apartment developments. Okay? So over 10 years, over a 10-year period, the population of Anaheim grew by roughly 25%. Okay, that's a big growth rate over a 10-year period, a quarter increase in the population. In that same time frame, the housing stock grew by 6%. Okay, so what's going to be the result of that? What's that? Increase in housing prices. So housing prices went up. So when I left to come here, I sold my house for 3 times what I paid for it over a 7-year period. Okay, there was nothing on the stock market that was doing as well as that. Okay, so that was a great investment. Buying a house in Anaheim and selling it to come here 7 years later for 3 times what I paid for it. It's awesome. And I've left all those other 4 seconds behind. So what's the result? Think about how this is going to play out. Just think about those 2 figures: increase in population by 25% and an increase in housing stock by 6%. What's the result?
So if people don't have anywhere to live, they've got to go somewhere.
Yes.
So they'll migrate to maybe further away or a different city just if it's
No. You're now saying something that's counterfactual. What did I say was the population increase?
25%.
Okay, so they're not going somewhere else.
Just homeless?
Homelessness?
There's more people living in the same number of structures.
Yes, exactly. Overcrowding. So all those old, seedy 1950s motels around Disneyland, right? And some of you have probably seen them, right? Or you've seen them in the old 70s TV shows, right? So the seedy motels around Disneyland, okay, they became what we call single room occupancy units. They basically were housing people on an ongoing basis, families and so forth, in hotel rooms. Okay? Places that had no kitchen, weren't set up for that, and so forth. Okay? So lots of dangerous conditions, code violations, and so forth. Apartments, houses, people would go in, 2, 3, 4 families apiece, right? And buy or rent, okay? And so you had kids sleeping in closets. Right? I mean, think about how this is going to go, right? I mean, so you did not have any fewer people parking on the street. You did not have any less traffic on the street. You didn't have any fewer people in the schools, right? So the zoning power was completely ineffectual as stopping a demographic trend. Okay? There's a demographic trend, and it's like a freight train, and it was happening, and whether Anaheim was going to build more housing or whether people were simply going to go somewhere else in Anaheim to overcrowding, to homelessness, a lot of camping along the Santa Ana River in Anaheim. I mean, like, hey kids, let's go camping. I mean, like homeless people living along the river, and so forth. Okay, so that is what happened. And so what that tells you is that that boundaries are not you're not complete. You can't have total boundaries either in a land use system. It doesn't work. There are a lot of forces that are at play that are much bigger than the land use regulatory system can handle. So it becomes this back and forth, this mix of freedom and boundaries. Some regulation, but you're just not going to achieve everything you want with regulation. Okay, and so with this, it challenges the folks whose sort of thinking is all very sort of on the far end of the freedom side or on the far end of the regulation side, because the reality in the land use regulatory system is that it's actually some mix that is happening, that the system is bringing together some mix of freedom and boundaries. Okay? So that's what it's about. Okay? It is, just to reiterate, it is not a system that is set up to achieve environmental harm or injustice or economic inefficiency from the outset. It's a system that's set up to do these things, mediate these functions. The system also has, any system has location and scale. Where is it located and what kind of scale? So first, what we have to understand is that the land use regulatory system is dealing with a variety of scales, often nested scales, in terms of ecology or ecosystems, how nature is structured, and maybe some other kind of physical systems, but basically sort of the environment, social system, society. Okay, so how we're regulating land use in Louisville or in Anaheim or wherever occurs within broad-scale society. It also occurs within the context of lots of little social groups and communities and neighborhoods and so forth in those cities. There is economic scale, so there are sort of little smaller scale economies going on. Food trucks downtown that's an economy, right, in Louisville, right? But then there's also global economy, right? So a whole range, so you can scale up and down, right? So the global economy. So for example, you go back to Laguna Beach. Okay, there is a global economy in shoes. Okay, and so if Laguna Beach isn't going to allow a store to sell the shoes that that store wants to sell, which is like, okay, I can always say they were nutty. That's totally nutty, right? But they don't allow them to sell. Okay, if nothing else, what is going to happen? People in Laguna Beach are going to order those shoes from Amazon, and those trucks are going to show up and deliver those shoes to their front door in Laguna Beach, right? I mean, it's a global economy, right? So we have to think about that. Temporal scale. Okay, so there are short-term effects of land use decisions, but there are also long-term effects and long-term trends going on and everything in between. So what we're talking about here is that we have to understand that land use is occurring within these various scales. But then we also need to think about jurisdiction. So this is political and legal scale. So most land use regulation actually happens at the local government level, city or county. But the state government defines a lot of those local powers. So a lot of the authority comes from the state. The state legislature can enact laws that shape what local governments can and can't do in terms of local land use regulatory powers. And there are a number of states in which there are state governmental entities, authorities, agencies, and so forth that have significant say over land use. Okay, so Oregon has a lot of statewide planning and statewide controls. That's a state that does. Florida did for a while. Some of it got scaled back in recent years, but there is still some greater degree of state involvement in land use planning and regulation in Florida than there is in Kentucky, for example. Okay? There are differences from state to state. The federal government regulates certain aspects of land use, and we'll get into that later. But if your land is the subject, is home or habitat to endangered species, if it has a wetland that is within the federal government's authority under the Clean Water Act, okay, you are now going to have to get permits from federal agencies. If your land development proposal is to build a telecommunications tower, okay, you are going to be subject to some amount of local land use control, but some of that has been preempted by the federal government, okay, under the Telecommunications Act. Okay, so the local government cannot just stop cell towers from being located in a city, although it can define certain conditions, certain locations, certain design parameters, and so on and so forth. So, so there's a variety of sort of political legal scale. However, more broadly, in the United States, the dominant sort of scale concept here is what's called localism. Okay? I said before, most land use planning, regulation, and so forth occurs at the local government level, cities or counties, and that is because, in large part, we in our social and political culture, as well as our legal culture, embrace the idea that the local scale is the right scale. Okay? So we don't trust the folks in Frankfurt. We certainly don't trust the folks in Washington, D.C. We probably actually don't trust the Metro Council and the mayor either. But we trust them more than to deal with local land use. Right? This localism is just a concept, a powerful organizing principle for the location and scale of land use in the United States. And the other big one is private property ownership. Okay, so, and we're going to talk about a variety of limits on private property rights. We're going to talk about in lots of different ways. But it is difficult to overestimate the role of private property ownership, private property rights, and our commitment to private property rights in the United States in the land use system. Okay, so let's think about this for a moment. Let's assume that there is a piece of unused, vacant property, no buildings or anything. Let's say just down the street here, South Louisville, but within the Louisville metro jurisdiction. Nobody's using it, and so forth. And let's assume some planners for Louisville Metro, or the mayor of Louisville Metro, or a bunch of members of Louisville Metro Council decide in their infinite wisdom that the highest and best use of that property would be to put in a bookstore. That we need a bookstore in South Louisville, and that is the best use of the property. That property is owned by a private party. Okay, can they just pass a law that is going to force the property owner to build and operate a bookstore on that site? No. Okay. Now, and that's what earlier contrast is for centralized planned economies. That's exactly how those systems work. Is the government decides something's going to happen, and they tell people what's going to happen. Okay, perhaps this will be a big surprise to you, but in our colonial and early republic history in the United States, there were laws that mandated people affirmatively use their property in certain ways, and if they didn't, they would forfeit the ownership of their property. And these come from basically they come from powers of the British Crown to force that to happen. And it was largely, actually, to be honest with you, it was largely driven by the fact that they were trying to settle and colonize an undeveloped world, and they didn't want people to be slackers about their land. And they also didn't want, the one thing they wanted them to do, by the way, is to drain the wetlands, because that was where you got like malaria and yellow fever from the mosquitoes, right? Okay, so that was, we now want to save the wetlands, but back in the colonial period we wanted to drain them. And so if you didn't drain your wetland, you could lose ownership of your land. Just went to the colonial governor or the king or whatever. Okay, but what I'm saying is, early in our history, despite kind of whatever our myths are about freedom and independence and so on and so forth, there was this phenomenon in the land use area in the United States. That is not us now, right? That is definitely not us. You would be, at least all kinds of pushback if local officials tried to tell an owner what they should do with their property, which is different than saying there are certain things you cannot do with your property, right? So regulation of private property is normal, but directing property owners to affirmatively do something with their land is not. There are a handful of exceptions. There are some exceptions out there, but for the most part, in my experience throughout most of the United States, that even when the local government is regulating private property rights, if the argument is largely, if the landowner starts arguing with some degree of persuasion, you are unjustly infringing on my private property rights, it tends to produce a fair amount of anxiety and consternation and wringing of hands and defensiveness tendency for local government officials to back off, okay? And so forth. Now, there's obviously, don't be carried away with that, there's lots of regulations which landowners don't like, and the government imposes them anyway. But what I'm saying is that private property ownership is an important, not only fact, but norm, value in our land use regulatory system. We tend to respect private property rights quite a bit, again, subject to some regulations and so forth, but that tends to be a part of what goes on. The other thing is, there's just quite a lot of land in the United States that's privately owned. And so that means that you've got lots and lots of different people deciding what they're going to do with the land. This is not going to be as much of a coordinated approach. And interestingly enough, in the American West, where the federal government has retained ownership of quite a bit of the land, that's incredibly controversial. And there's a constant sort of pushback again to convert some of that land to private property. So again, sort of key components, key aspects of the system, components of the system. So there are three big things I want to say here. One is obviously land. We're talking about land. Land is a big part of the land use regulatory system. Poor Pierce, you said this before, and I said, well, what do you mean? But the point here is, I mean, this is not, our land use regulatory system is not largely an ecology or ecosystem system, right? I mean, it's not, and honestly, we care about economics and economic development, but it is not primarily a mechanism for managing the economy, right? Whether it's local or broader. It is largely a system for managing land, right? And so we just can't forget that, can't underestimate that. The land use regulatory system is actually relatively thin on law and thick on policy. So there are some rules, okay? And then as I said before, they're important. Okay, so I do not want anybody to think, like, why am I taking this class? It's just a public policy class. We're going to learn a number of rules, and they're going to be pretty significant rules. They're very important. But like I said, there's just not that many of them. And the rules are largely about what are the parameters in which policy decisions can be made. Right? They're largely just about the parameters in which policy decisions can be made. So land use regulation is really actually very thick on policy, on choices about what we want our communities to look like. So I contrast sort of rules versus tools. There are some rules, but land use law is much more about the tools that are available to various parties to manage and control and use land. Okay? So we're going to talk about things like, for example, subdivision maps, conditional use permits, performance zoning. Okay? And you will, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, that's fine. I'm not expecting you to, but you will. By the time we're going to go through that, we'll talk about this. Those are really important aspects of the system that shape what we do, how we can go about doing it. Okay? And then, as we've been talking all along, social, political, and economic forces are really important aspects. In terms of processes, okay, so all systems have processes. What I want to suggest here is land use planning and regulation really has a bunch of different processes. So one of the things that can happen in this kind of class is for us to spend time only looking at regulation. Okay? So regulation is a key process, it's an important process, perhaps the most central process to the system, but planning is a big component. Investing is a process that goes on. Okay, so if you don't have any investment happening, you don't have any land use happening. Okay? So investment is an aspect. Okay? Enforcement is an aspect. Okay? It's a process that's going on. Collaboration is a process that's going on. People getting together and cooperating and coordinating and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. So in my article, I list 13 different types of processes. I'm not going to go through them all here. But my point here is simply to say that there are a number of different processes that typically go on in the land use planning and regulatory system. And so it's not just one thing that's happening. And then in terms of values. So again, a lot of the criticisms make some assumptions that there are certain values embedded in the system. And we see examples of value choices. But when it actually comes down to it, there is more a normative or ethical pluralism. So you see values that promote environmental regulation, and you see values that promote private property rights and freedoms. Okay, you see values that promote sort of the favoring of the powerful, the favoring of people who already have resources. You see forces. You see values that tend to be to reflect certain discrimination. But then you also see values in the system that promote equity and justice and that sort of thing, right? And so you can see in the decisions that get made some degree of competition. So that goes back to this whole idea that this is largely a mediating system. This is largely a system in which we're sort of seeing the tensions and the battles between different sorts of values play out. So let's again think about Topgolf, right? Okay, Topgolf as an example, right? That was a pretty hard-fought battle between some competing values about what was going to happen out there at Oxmoor Mall, right? Does everybody follow what I'm saying there? Right, and so, it's, I think, a mistake to say that the system was going to inevitably lead to one thing or the other. That necessarily means that land use planning and regulation is inherently political. And I don't necessarily mean partisan, because actually in this field you can find people of different parties coalescing, forming coalitions, because a lot of times it's local and so forth. So it's not always partisan, but it's very political. It is about competing forces and interests in our society that are trying to shape the policy choices that we make. How our communities are going to be shaped, how we're going to use resources, who gets resources, that kind of thing. And so one of the things is that you're going to see in some of the thoughts about planning this idea that there is some sort of objective, rational principles, a set of principles that are going to guide land use into some sort of superior manifestation of the public good. Okay? And by the way, so I'm a person who tends to like things like the public good and the public interest. I think they're real things. I don't think everything is just like interest group politics and wow, let's slit our wrists and that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm not. In other words, the thing is, I'm relatively hopeful type of person. Okay? So I'm not. I don't sort of say, it's all just grubby interest group politics. Having said that, though, one of the big weaknesses of planning as a field, is planning theory, is this idea that it's somehow the place where some apolitical, non-political, broader principles are. And the reality is planning as a process is an inherently political process. Okay? And there have been, in recent years, a number of important planning theorists who've said exactly that. Okay? And so we're talking next week about planning concepts and different views of planning, but I'll just sort of plant the seed. Somebody named John Forrester, who's a planning professor at Cornell, is one of the people who's written some of the most significant and actually really pretty practical, pretty accessible work on this and so forth. But it's out there now increasingly, and it's sort of just a wake-up call that, okay, no, the planners are not going to come in and save us from ourselves. Okay? So let me say that again. The planners are not going to come in and save us from ourselves. Okay, so the decisions that happen in the land use area are because we are choosing to make those decisions, right? It's not because some bad system has been put in place by somebody else out there that is causing us to sprawl. It is because we have chosen to sprawl, okay? And that's the reality. And I mean, we can talk about whether it's good or bad or whatever. All I'm just saying is this is how the system works. There are, well, I do want to say, though, that the land use regulatory system raises a lot of questions and concerns and issues and competing ideas about justice. Okay? So it is not a system that is totally disregards issues of justice. It's actually pretty concerned with pushing issues, but there are a lot of, again, competing views about what counts as land use justice. So that's going to be pretty relevant to us. Okay, so let's take a break, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some big themes in land use, and also see if I can't pull up a little PowerPoint about examples of good and bad planning. So let's take a maybe just a 7-minute break if you can, and then we'll start about that.
I like it.
All right. We got it. All right. Okay, so just to pull some of this together, I want to sort of say there's going to be some themes that run through the course, and they relate to the structure, but just to kind of pull this into a list of 4 big picture themes. And again, what we're interested in the class is what you do with this in dealing with real-world land use conflicts. So this is not about sort of some developing some abstract theory about land use. This is not about let me regurgitate this back to you on the exam, Professor Arnold, and that kind of thing. But just to help you think about what we're doing here. So one of the questions is, where does the authority for certain land use decisions, land use processes, where does that authority come from? Okay, so one of the things that we oftentimes think about in law and to some degree in just land use planning and regulation generally has to do with limitations, restrictions, that kind of thing, right? And we get kind of carried away with that. And the starting point, though, is to ask, who has authority and what kind of authority? So we're going to spend some time talking about aspects of the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution. Okay? There are some aspects of the U.S. Constitution that are clearly sources of authority that affect land use regulation, but by and large, the actual source of authority for land use regulation, as you're going to we're going to spend plenty of time on in a couple of weeks, is actually what's something called the police power, which is held by state governments, and it is inherent in their sovereignty as states. So it's actually inherited from the British Crown, and initially by the original 13 colonies when they became independent, and then eventually, as each state came into the Union, it has a police power. So that's actually going to be a central focus. Now, the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, and constitutional law deal with the police power, but the source is not actually the U.S. Constitution. The source predates the U.S. Constitution, and it is more organic than that. And so what we're going to find is a lot of local governments get their power to control land use or regulate land use from the state, and the source of that is actually the police power. But there are a variety of aspects of the U.S. Constitution that are highly relevant, and that some of which actually provide some additional authority or some competing authority, and some of which provide limitations on that authority. But then we're going to get into other things like statutes and ordinances and regulations and other kinds of sources of authority. Next, we're going to deal with tools, and I've mentioned that. In many ways, land use is a lot more about tools than rules, and so we're going to deal with a whole lot of things: planning, zoning, permitting, flexible techniques, and there's a whole bunch of them. Environmental regulation. We're going to talk a little bit about study and assessment tools. So the students who took environmental law know quite a bit about a law called NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, okay, which involves the federal government doing environmental impact statements, but actually, the whole process of study and assessment is very much embedded in what local governments do in the land use field. Infrastructure and investments and so forth, a lot of tools. Processes and decision makers. So we're going to distinguish between legislative, administrative, and ministerial acts. That's going to become really important to us, and distinguishing the standards for those, judicial review of those. We're going to talk about the exercise of discretion by decision makers. How's that done? How broad is that discretion? How limited is that discretion? Rationality. So rationality or reasonableness is a term that gets used a lot in law in the United States, and we're going to look at kind of where does that come from and how does that play out in land use. Evidence, okay, so I talked earlier about facts. Now we're going to start turning facts into evidence. Evidence being how facts get presented to decision makers. What can actually be shown or presented to the decision maker. Participation is going to be key, and we're going to learn that processes and procedures matter a whole lot, and so forth. And then finally, we're going to look at limits. Of course, the law imposes a variety of limits on land use regulators, and it imposes a variety of limits on landowners and users of land, developers and so forth. Okay, so we're going to look at that. Those. We're also going to look at some of the kind of so things like limits on legal authority, limits on individual rights, and so on and so forth. But we're also going to look at some of the sort of inherent limits that are out there. So I talked a little bit today about the economy. I talked about demographic trends and how those forces can be also limits. And those are going to be important in thinking about in the work that you're doing. So you're going to develop a lot of good ideas, creative arguments, possible solutions, but you're also going to have to deal with sort of inherently, what is the context in which you're making these decisions or advocating these particular positions, and are there some inherent limits in there? So in other words, I'm hoping we're not really going to have this particular role, but I would hope that you would not eventually you would not be the advocates or decision makers who suggest somehow or other that zoning could stop the population growth of Anaheim, right? I mean, obviously there are these people who they're elected, they're not, they're reasonably bright people, but there was a overconfidence in what you could use the zoning power to do. Okay, and so hopefully over time we can explore some of those limits, and that you will be more effective in what you're doing in the hearings and the land use, and just your participation in land use beyond this class. What happens after you graduate? What happens, and whether you are ever sort of do professional work in this area, you're going to be a part of a community that has land use issues that arise all the time. And so hopefully you will be effective and informed and so forth. And so that's one of the sort of ideas behind this. Okay. Next week, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about planning. What are some of the legal standards regarding planning? Is it required? Is it allowed? What effect does it have? Okay. So all those are going to be important issues. There's some reading in the book about that. But one of the things I want you to do, and then we're also talking about planning more broadly. What are some different competing concepts of planning? And we started doing that today, but I want to introduce you to a variety of concepts. So yes, indeed, we will talk about Jane Jacobs next week, among others. So that is on tap for next week. I would like everybody to come with an example of good planning and an example of bad planning to you. Right? And then why do you think it's good planning, and why do you think your bad example is bad planning? Right? So in other words, and I really want to emphasize, this is about what you think. Okay? I do not want a bunch of people coming in telling me what you think I want to hear. Okay? That doesn't work very well, and it doesn't serve any good purpose. So I mean, there are no right or wrong answers here. What I'd really like to do is get some discussion about what counts as good planning and what doesn't, and so forth, and hopefully some variety of viewpoints on that. Okay? But I also want to get sort of a generation for us to generate a lot of ideas. But also, what's going to happen is you're going to break into small groups and work together as teams to present a couple of examples, and so from there, what we're going to do is start working on teamwork skills, but also advocacy skills. How would you go about convincing others that your example is either good or bad, depending on which one it is, right? Okay, so that's what we're going to do next week. So a bunch of different things in class, but please come with your examples. So in order to prime the pump, I'm going to share with you my examples, which I should immediately tell you that these are all totally wrong, and that you should come at this with an immense amount of skepticism, because these are just my particular quirky individual opinions. But hopefully, in this process, I will help to stimulate some thinking about what is good or bad planning. Oops. So my first example is a place I dearly love, Crystal Cove State Park in Orange County, California. So this is about halfway in between Laguna Beach and Newport Beach, and this is a state park with lots of hiking. It's got a great beach. It's on the ocean. It is an area of special biological significance under state designation because it's a birthing place for dolphins and so forth, and a variety of endangered species and so forth that are in Crystal Cove. Oh, actually, let me turn that. That's the outside. So this is there we go. There we go. So you can see better. Okay, so why do I think this is good planning? This is an area that has been under intense development pressure for decades. And it is some portion of the land around it is owned by the Irvine Company, a very large, powerful land development company, but basically developed all of the city of Irvine, California, and a bunch of other parts of the Orange County area. Part of the original Irvine Ranch, which was a Spanish, it started out as a Spanish land grant, and then went through when California was part of Mexico, and then the U.S. and so forth. But anyway, so a massive amount of land in Orange County, which then was a fast-growing area in the latter half of the 20th century. Disneyland, all this kind of stuff. And so, this area could have been all housing development, condos, resort hotels. And back this way, there is there's Pelican Hill, is a sort of golf resort community, Marriott golf resort community. So there's hotel and condos and golf courses and so forth. So there's a lot of land development up to it. You see Pacific Coast Highway there, PCH, Highway 1, great for cruising along and so forth. Now up across PCH from this, I think further on from where you see this, is a shopping mall with fancy shops and stuff like that. And of course a Starbucks, because you can't go more than 10 or 20 yards without getting to a Starbucks in California and so forth. But anyway, lots of intense land development pressure. Ages ago, I think this was back in the 70s, if I got my time frame right, the sort of environmentalist in the state of California could foresee the land development pressures. And it was a time in which the Irvine Company was certainly doing a lot of building, but they also could use an infusion of cash to do other kind of development. And to be honest, let's not sort of treat the Irvine Company as unusually public interested. I think to some degree they saw that if they could get paid to have this turned into a state park, basically to sell it to the state, then it would actually increase land development values in the area in the long run. And so they could actually make more profit in the long run. So, but anyway, but it was, I think, a mutuality of interest. And so it was purchased by the state and set aside. And it is this amazing, quiet retreat place. I used to go there all the time when I taught in Orange County. And it's, you get away from the traffic, you get away from the people. There is a fee, there's a user fee which is actually true with all the state parks now in California, due to the budget issues. But what it meant is that the beach was rarely crowded, okay? Unlike Huntington Beach, which is a big expansive beach, but also lots of available parking, and so it's just much more crowded. So this was a really amazing place, but the ecology was great, the hiking was great, and by the way, they also had, from a very long, back from the maybe the 40s, but certainly the 50s, this place called the Shake Shack, which was a surfer stop on PCH right there at the top of the hill in Crystal Cove, and they have of course hamburgers and stuff like that, but shakes and amazing date shakes. So that's one of the things you can get in Southern California that's really awesome because the dates are grown there, they're fresh and so forth. So it's this place that the surfers would pull in right off of PCH and get their shakes. Well, but you can walk up to it from the park and from the state park and the hiking and so forth. And so it's just this great public space that really conserves and manages well this sort of rich, diverse ecology, and it was very thoughtfully planned ahead of time to avoid or limit the development pressures. And also, by the way, does a lot of work filtering out a lot of the polluted runoff that comes from development further uphill, and so that ends up being an important part of it too. So it's green and blue infrastructure, as mentioned earlier. Okay, so my second example is my neighborhood. It's actually a Class 6 city, but it's really, in essence, a neighborhood in East Louisville. It's out between the Waterson and the Gene Snyder's Murray Hill, off of Goose Creek Road, in between Westport Road and Brownsboro Road. Okay, and don't come looking for me at midnight on Friday night, with the bar crawl or whatever. So but anyway, I live out there, and it's the suburbs. It's the suburbs, and this is a unpopular and shocking thing to say in a planning class. Many urban planning students are, tend to be skeptical of the sprawl-embracing, sprawl-contributing suburbs. But I want to and I do love living out here, and I want to suggest, and I have lived in a lot of high-density places, mixed-use environments and so forth in my life. So I've done that. I'm partly just at the age where I like to be quiet in the trees and the peaceful environment, and I like, okay, this is not surprising, but I like being away from the University of Louisville, right? When the politics and stuff are going on, I mean, not partisan politics, but university politics, law school politics are going on. It's nice to be far away, so I don't, I don't get called in quickly. Poor Dean Crawford lives in Old Louisville. He can't ever really get far away from the school. So anyway, but there are some things about this. So, part of what I want to suggest here is that suburban development can be good planning if it's thoughtfully done. And I also want to suggest that we are not going to cease having suburbs. So we need to start thinking about how we're going to do it thoughtfully, as opposed to just sort of saying, oh, well, we need to have a lot of sort of downtown condo development or mixed-use development, infill development. I mean, that's true, but if what you're saying is, hey, we aren't going to pay attention to the suburban development because we don't like it, I think that's a mistake, because there is a demand for it. It's not ceasing. And by the way, the kind of property I own is the image that every demographic group in the United States picks as their ideal home. Okay? So the majority of every demographic group picks the suburban home with the 2.3 kids and the dog in the yard, right, and so forth. And there is a greater percentage of millennials who do not want to live in the suburbs. So there is some shift in the demographics, but nonetheless, even with young millennials, there is the surveys show a majority of them still want to end up in the suburban single-family home. Okay, and that is, and then there are people who say, this is sort of cultural illness in the United States. I was just recently in Lisbon, Portugal, in Antwerp, Belgium, where nobody has as much space as we do, right? I mean, you live in some little tiny apartment in Old Louisville or Germantown, and you still have more space than people in Lisbon or Antwerp do. So we do not do densely packed development very much. We tend to like our space here. But I think there's some things to say about this that are interesting. First of all, this was built late 60s, early 70s. There is actually diversity of styles of homes in Murray Hill, so they're not all cookie cutter, they don't all look the same. My particular home is the red brick Georgian, the poor professor's version of Locust Grove, right? Which is popular in Louisville. But there's a diversity, and it was the developer had gone and seen a development somewhere in the East Coast and come back with this idea of doing this. And what he did was he built to the contours of the land. So rather than just tear everything down, it was an old potato farm. Okay? And the family that owned it for centuries, was Murray, and they had an old farmhouse on the top of the hill, which is still there. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. So this is out in the burbs in Louisville, and they have this old historic farmhouse that is right in smack down in the middle of the subdivision that they kept. People still live there, and so forth. There's the old graveyard right behind the house. Okay, so some preservation and conservation going on there. So he built to the contours of the land. There is this big loop called Murray Hill Pike. It's just this road that is a big oval around and it connects to neighborhoods on both sides. Connects out to Goose Creek Road. You can connect through the other neighborhood to Westport Road. You can connect through two other neighborhoods to Brownsboro Road. So lots of points of entry and exit and so forth. And then there are these little cul-de-sacs off of it. But behind the houses are these walking and bicycle paths, which are all in and out behind the houses. So you see, that's that here. In my neighborhood, there is more walking than I have ever seen anywhere. Now, are people walking to the grocery store every day and bringing home their French loaf bread and their pasta sauce in their little bags? No, that is not. You actually can walk to grocery stores and other sort of retail establishments from my neighborhood. People don't do that a lot; they mostly drive. But actually, in any given week, I probably see 4, 5, 6 people just in the time that I'm there around who are walking back from the store with something. So it does happen. But really, what people are doing is getting out and just enjoying the nature, enjoying the neighborhood, walking and so forth. People are very friendly. They look after each other. It's a very strong sense of community. When I lived out in California, where we were all much closer to each other physically, people did not speak to each other. Why? Okay, well, actually, there was some social science research that was done that showed that actually in higher density development, you get less community because people form psychological space if they don't have physical space. Okay, so this is contrary to what a lot of the critiques of the suburbs had been, because the critiques said, well, gosh, there's no sense of community. Everybody just drives and they don't know each other. So, well, turns out that might be true of some suburban communities. There's some McMansion communities where people aren't very friendly, very, very close, but that's not true. It's not inherent in suburbia. Right? It's not inherent in the suburban neighborhood. Anyway, and very green, lots of green and blue infrastructure. I do have to say, so my yard has gone a lot more native over the years. I sort of started that way and kind of done more and more of that. I do have to say, I have become disappointed in recent years by people cutting down trees. They are freaked out by windstorms and ice storms, and so there has been this deforestation of my neighborhood, which bothers me. But there are so many mature trees in my neighborhood that it so far hasn't had a huge impact. But anyway, so that is Murray Hill. Washington, D.C. is a mixed picture. So this is, by the way, when I was in college. I was an intern at Capitol Hill, and I had more hair and less weight. But so that's my quintessential Washington, D.C. picture. But okay, so what about Washington is awesome? Okay, big, broad boulevards. They're really European-style boulevards, right? Lots of monuments everywhere, lots of parks everywhere, right? The government buildings are monumental. They're big, huge, lots of columns, right? You get in Washington, D.C. is a relatively open-field city, right? I mean, walk up and down the mall and so on and so forth. Okay, so lots of cultural and ethnic diversity. You can have pretty much any cuisine in the world in Washington, D.C. If you go to the right, if you want to search for it, there's a restaurant that serves it, right, somewhere in Washington, D.C. Lots of things to do, and because it's the nation's capital, many of the things are free. That's one of the things I love. Okay, so this is when I was intern. Okay, I had no money. Okay, I was there on a research grant. I had no money. I was poor. I had peanut butter in my dorm room at Georgetown University most nights for dinner. Okay, so actually, what I really did was I ran around to all of the receptions. Who cares? The Argentinian embassy. I don't know anybody from Argentina, but I'm going to the reception, right? Because it's free food, right? Okay, you guys do. Dimitri does this all the time. Right? You understand you're poor, you're a student, you go for the free food. Okay, but not only that, but entertainment and museums. I mean, you just go. It's lots of things to do. Okay, so so Washington D.C. is awesome in that respect. It is a city that is undergoing tremendous gentrification and displacement. Right? It has a history of racism and sort of racial oppression in its planning history, in its land use and redevelopment history. And at some point, we're going to see actually what Justice Thomas has to say about that in one of the cases. So it's the sort of thing that has prompted some attention. And right now, unfortunately, one of the things that's going on is that in the southeastern side of the city, which has traditionally been very low income and African American, the Anacostia neighborhood and other neighborhoods around it, there's just this. The market is so hot and the redevelopment is so aggressive that many of the people who live there for a long time are being displaced, and it's causing a lot of sort of serious problems. And there's been no sort of advanced planning, advanced thinking about how we're going to get a handle on that. Lexington. So to bring something a little closer to home, closer to home. So Lexington is my mixed example. Lexington, and you're going to hear say it again later, but Lexington actually had the first urban growth boundary in the United States. Everybody talks about Portland, like Portland was the first, Portland was the only one, blah, 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 Portland, blah, blah, blah. Okay, it was Lexington, okay? So those of you in your UK sweatshirt over there, hoodie, that love UK and Lexington, you need to be aggressive about spreading the word that actually the first urban growth boundary was Lexington, not Portland. In how this developed, why they developed this, and they call it urban service boundary. And it's basically that utility services cannot be extended to development outside the service boundary. Okay? And there's some exceptions, and you can get some variances, and blah, blah, blah. But basically, the idea is to protect the horse farm lands that lead to world-class thoroughbreds. Okay? So we birth and grow world-class thoroughbreds in the bluegrass region around Lexington, right? Everybody follow? They go dirty winters and so on. Okay, why? It's because the soils contain phosphorus and other elements that in a combination or to a degree that does not exist anywhere else, certainly in the United States and maybe in the world. Okay, and so the horses graze on the grasses that end up producing big, strong horses with big, strong bones and so forth. Okay, and then this was discovered more than a century ago, right? And we've known this for a long time. And so Lexington saw growth on the horizon. They saw the potential that once those horse farms were developed, that land was gone for raising horses forever. So Lexington's sort of status as the place where thoroughbreds are born and raised would be lost. Okay, it's a resource that simply is distinct, unique, and can't be replicated. Can be really, at least theoretically, can't be reclaimed or restored at a later point in time. So they created this growth boundary, and they selected the areas of non-development based on the content of the soils. Okay, a totally scientific basis for what land gets to be developed or not. And there have been fights over this from time to time because of growth pressures in Lexington. But for the most part, the folks who are protecting the bluegrass horse farms from development have remained politically successful. Politically, they've been able to sort of fend off the efforts to weaken this and so forth. And it is something very distinctive. So that's the plus. The minus is, have you ever tried to drive in Lexington? Oh my gosh, it is the poorest transportation planning I have ever experienced. Okay, whenever I go to Lexington, it takes me less time to go from Louisville to Lexington than it does to get to my destination in Lexington once I've gotten there. Right, once I've got to the edge of the city. I'm like, who thought this up? This is terrible. It's just a terrible way to get around. So anyway, and if there's an accident, forget it. It's just So that's an example of and I know that's very auto dependent, but it is what it is. Okay, negative, my bad example, Las Vegas. Okay, so and this is again planning, because I'm not suggesting that a weekend in Las Vegas is necessarily a bad thing. But what I am saying here is that this is not a well-planned community in my view, for several reasons. First of all, it is. It's a very artificial community, right? I mean, okay, like Eiffel Tower, the Statue of Liberty or whatever, right? In Nevada. I mean, I'm not a Mandalay Bay. I mean, I don't know. It's to me, it's sort of artificial and garish and so forth. But the other big one that I think is really problematic is that you had sort of massive uncontrolled growth and development, that much of which was very water dependent in an area that gets 3 to 5 inches of rainfall a year. We have had times when we've gotten 3 to 5 inches of rainfall in an hour, okay? And they get 3 to 5 inches of rainfall per year. Their source of water, which is really in essence the Colorado River, is over allocated. There's not enough water, and so they are. So what they're finding is that their supply as a reservoir is decreasing in height over time, so that the water level is going down, and they're actually running a risk before long that the top of the water level is going to be below their lowest intake. Their lowest intake height. Okay, so that's a problem. That's a major problem. And Las Vegas is a big part of our economy and culture in this country. So I will tell you right now that we will. The U.S. It will be in major decline as a nation before we ever let Las Vegas go dry. Right? If we can't get water into Las Vegas, it means we as a nation are in trouble because we politically, so going back to this sort of structural land use regulation system, as politically we are too committed to the viability of Las Vegas. Right? Does everybody follow me? I mean, right? I mean, okay. So when you have Laura Bush on TV going around saying what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas or whatever, right? That tells you, right, that there's this sort of whole cultural phenomenon where we are committed to the viability of Las Vegas, but it is in a largely unsustainable place. It has not been planned well, and it has not been a good system to figure out. And so eventually they got around to imposing a variety of limitations on, for example, growing Kentucky bluegrass in lawns in Las Vegas because they take a lot of water, and so that's totally not the right landscape. But people said they had a constitutional right to grow Kentucky bluegrass and to wash their cars in their front driveway with the hose running constantly, continuously. And that was their constitutional right. So it became this big political effort to try to get people to commit in any way whatsoever to conservation, water conservation in Las Vegas. And I just think part of that is because the whole city was planned on, a mirage, right? So, I mean, not to try to. Yeah, I knew you'd like that, Patrick. Right? So, I mean, not to try to crack puns, but it really is. It's not, it's not sustainable as it is. And then lastly, we're spending quite a bit of time talking about West Louisville. But West Louisville is, by and large, a total planning disaster. Okay? I mean, there are so many environmental, economic, social, political, physical conditions about West Louisville that are ignored, unaddressed. There is, when we work, you all know, or many of you know, that this Resilience Justice Project, and part of what we find is that a major theme with respect to, actually with respect to most marginalized and oppressed communities, but especially West Louisville, is underinvestment and disinvestment in the neighborhood's infrastructure. Okay, and by infrastructure, we mean not just the physical infrastructure, but that's very poor and deteriorating as well, but also social capital and social infrastructure, political power and participation and engagement, economic and financial infrastructure. I mean, the whole thing is really a mess. And some things sort of happen, I wouldn't say by accident, but for example, Rubbertown is there initially not as some sort of effort to expose people to pollution, but because of the combination of World War II and the location on the river when the nation desperately needed rubber and other chemical manufacturing, right? Okay? And at the time, quite frankly, West Louisville was considerably more mixed race, mixed income, right? And over time, what we've seen is that it has become increasingly segregated, increasingly poor, and the pollution problems have gotten worse. And like I said, it's not just underinvestment, but it's actually literally disinvestment in the neighborhood infrastructure in West Louisville. And so we're going to deal with that in a variety of ways. I will say, just in the very broadest sense, that I think there are a lot of leaders in Louisville generally, and I'm not going to talk about anybody in particular, but just in general, there's a lot of awareness that there are big issues in West Louisville. And there's a lot of lip service to, we need to do something about this. But I think the general observation of anybody who pays any attention to what actually happens there, and the general complaint of most people who live there, is that it's exactly that, it's lip service. It is rhetoric, and the actual change does not happen. So I think that's a challenge. And so we're going to see that both with the Weston Walmart, and then again with the U.S. Farmers Biofuel, and can sort of think about both of those problems in this broader context. So I would love to hear what you think as good, bad, next week. And so
I was just thinking about Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
Also, one other thing real quick, before you leave, think about where in the class you want to sit, because I'm going to sit around a seating chart. So I know a number of you, but some of you I don't know, and so it will help. But also, as we work on this project, if I need to find somebody quickly, rather than trying to remember, Connor sat here in this class, but sat there, right, I can just look at this chart and be like, oh yeah, I got to go over here.